Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 121st of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the third week of June 2024. In today's podcast, 70% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure was totally destroyed. We'll talk about the latest updates from the front lines and covering new permissions to use Western long range missiles give Ukraine new advantages. So during the war, the Ukrainian power generation lost more than 40 gigawatt of capacity. So, due to occupation and destruction, Ukraine lost almost 70% of electricity generation or 40 gigawatt out of 52 gigawatt Ukraine had before the full scale invasion. The situation is truly critical in Ukraine. The households have electricity outages for 8-10 hours on a daily basis. So the energy system has gone through three phases of destruction. The first occurred at the beginning of full scale invasion in 2022 when the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant was occupied by Russian forces and part of the Ukraine's wind and solar generation was lost to the same reasons. As you know, as of today, Russia occupies around 20% of Ukrainian territory. In the second phase, the Russians attacked distribution networks. The state company Ukrenergo, transformer nodes, local networks, and generation facilities were constantly shelled, and most of them were destroyed. The third phase began in the end of March of 2024, when the Russians began to shell thermal and hydropower generation facilities. Due to the latest phase, we've lost 9 gigawatts, or about 50% of our winter peak consumption, just in the last couple of months. In total, Ukraine lost over 40 gigawatts, or approximately 70-75%, which are of the total electricity generation, which are a very tremendous numbers. So Ukraine is rebuilding infrastructure with the finance and the Western allies and equipment delivered from Western allies. But still, Ukraine will restore only 7% of its power generation needed by winter. Before the heating season, Ukraine can restore only 200, maybe 250 megawatt of generation, which is only 7.1% of the required 3.5 gigawatts. So, according to the director of Energy Research Center, work is proceeding in many directions and the projects are already being implemented. However, even the joint efforts of businesses, municipal structures, and state owned companies will at best result in additional generation volume of up to 250 megawatts. The experts consider that this new generation volume to be will be a good result. But still, we have no choice but import electricity from the European countries. But the next year, it's impossible to install an additional 1 or 1.2 gigawatt of energy capacity, which is approximately 35% of needed capacity. This is a very short time frame to create this much generation capacity, as implemented projects of this size typically require 3 to 5 years. However, the general director of electricity provider in Ukraine, Yasna, Sergei Kovalenko, said that if generation and import opportunities remain at the current level, that the system's deficit will reach about 35%. However, Ukraine is adapting to live under daily blackout schedule after Russia destroyed almost half of the country's energy facilities. Since March 22, Russia has renewed its missile terror on Ukraine and inflicted about 1 billion in losses on the power industry. This year, Moscow began specifically targeting thermal power plants, hydroelectric power stations, and energy storage facilities, a marked shift in tactics from the winter 2023 to 2024, when the attacks were less precise and the damage easier to repair. This happened due to better weapons Russia has been using to hit thin Ukrainian air defenses. Officials have also acknowledged that blackouts this winter cannot be avoided but only minimized. Ukraine is trying to rebuild as many facilities as it can using parts from decommissioned power plants in Europe. Meanwhile, energy companies are securing as many generators and gas turbines as possible to support critical infrastructure through the winter and are working with European partners to increase electricity imports. Some Ukrainians have begun installing solar panels on their houses. Ukraine has announced new grants to help housing cooperatives invest in panels and heat pumps. Some Ukrainians are looking to rent small houses outside of Kiev with wood burning stove to survive the winter, because this winter is going to be a hard winter, and it cannot be compared to the winter of 2022 in 2023. At the same time, Russia gathers huge profits from exporting oil and gas and seeks ways to circumvent sanctions, while Ukraine requires a $50 billion to rebuild and protect its infrastructure. That's equivalent to the entire loan secured by the profits from the frozen Russian assets, which Ukraine was recently promised but may not receive for months. The G7, having already spent $3 billion on support of Ukraine energy sector, announced an additional 1 billion to help the country to survive. However, the country cannot afford to wait for those decisions, as it urgently needs more protection and significantly more air defenses for its energy infrastructure. So let's talk about what's the latest from the front lines. So north of Kharkiv region, the much reported madness and severe battle in the center of Vovchansk village that the Russians got into was destroyed, and at least 20 plus soldiers were captured alive. Additional Russian attacks from the north were repulsed. In fact, the Russians still hold only the last few houses in the north of the village of Vovchansk. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are engaged in destroying Russia's construction equipment with FPV drones, which are building a line of defense north of the city. Next location, Chasiv Yar in the Donetsk region, which is actually located in the west of Bakhmut, that is currently occupied by Russians. The Russians managed to gain a foothold in the canal area because now they are constantly being harassed with constant fire by Ukrainian artillery and the Western provided ATACMS. So much so they haven't progressed any further in the past few days. So only 2 days ago, they launched another attack on Kalinivka village north of Chasiv Yar, but the armed forces of Ukraine wiped them out there. Next direction, Avdiivka Pokrovsk, also in the Donetsk region. The Russians are still advancing through Novoalexandrivka village and still advancing on Sokil, losing troops and equipment like there is no tomorrow. Well, there is no tomorrow for the bulk of their troops there that have been destroyed. Similarly, and while the Ukraine armed forces is slowly withdrawing from the area between Yasnobrodivka and Karlivka, the Russians are still attacking these two places. Another direction, Marinka, the village of Marinka in the Donetsk region. The 46th Airborne Brigade has cleared most of the Russians who entered this village last week, but the Russians are still bombing and shelling the village. By the way, there is a good example of what happens even when the Russians capture some abandoned empty Ukrainian line or a site. They're still destroyed by Ukrainian attacks. In Krasnohorivka village, the same as the month before. The Russians attack, the Ukrainian takes them in a deadly embrace. So here's a few more details about the latest developments. So the Russians were ordered to capture the village of Chasiv, which is close to Bakhmut, but the attack on the Vovchansk weakened Russian forces. So the Deep State channel reports that the occupiers have built up to 10,000 personnel and 450 units of military equipment in the section from Rigorodka village to Novovadiny. It's approximately 20 kilometers from the village of Borova in the Kharkiv region. So, what is happening there now? If we consider the general Liman Kupian axis, a more active phase occurs in the Liman and Kupiansk directions. In the Limansky direction, they are trying to get to the left bank of the Zherebets River along the lines of Torse, Yamporivka, Terny, and Nevska. In the Kupiansk direction, they are trying to reach Kupiansk itself, breaking through Ukraine defense forces in the Sinkiivka area, but at the same time advancing in Peshany area and along the Tabaivka, Krokhmalne, Berestov line. But if you look at the map, Borova is almost in the center of this Limano-Kupiansk axis. This settlement will not only allow the Russians to go to the left bank of the Oskil River, but also to cut off the logistics that exist, for example, along this bank between the villages Borova, Simkiivka, Bohuslavska, with coverage and access without forcing to the right bank. This is the general plan of the Russians to control the left bank of the Oskil River. To put it mildly, access to the left bank of the Oskil River without access to Borova is not particularly bright for them. That is why they focus so much on this direction. It is known that the long defensive line in this direction is held by 3rd Separate Assault Brigade. By the way, they also reported that the enemy has become more active in the Luhansk region and is trying to capture the settlements of Chernishina and Pershatravne, followed by the capture of Borova, and that the Russians are currently carrying out heavy assault on this part of the front. But, and also Hortitsa, commenting on the plans of the Russian Federation regarding Borova, they said that they are ready for any developments of the in the Kharkiv region. I will say only one thing to this. In this location, the Russians have already tried to break through the our defense lines several times, but during this time they have not accomplished anything. So we can draw appropriate conclusions. So I will tell you what is happening in the Donetsk region. Chasiv Yar is the second most difficult section after the Pokrovsky direction as of today. This is because, for the Russians, the priority task set by the commanders is to capture Chasiv Yar as soon as possible. This is the general plan for advancing in the Krematorsk direction. An important point is that the Russian occupiers made some advances near Klishivka. Such a village actually doesn't exist anymore. There are no more ruins, there is no more buildings, there is even no ruins left. It's just a big burnt field that the Russians occasionally try to take control of. But there is a nuance. They had a southwesterly advance. They partially advanced on the territory of Klishivka on this scorched earth, but were repulsed and lost a lot of soldiers as well as equipment. In principle, Swings often occur along this line of Ivanivska, Klishivka, and Andriivka villages. When the Russians enter position, they take a picture or photo video just to post online and brag about their new wins, and with definitely the Russian flag. And from this, it's concluded that the position is controlled by the Russians. And some media companies, Russians and Westerns, which will like to read very much, begin to tell that here the Russians have taken over or completely took control of a new position such Ivanovska. And then there is such a situation that instead of the guys with the Russian cloth, the remains of the bodies remain, which we find on those positions. Therefore, this position is no longer controlled by the Russian. This is a swing along the line. So Russian come, take a picture, they're destroyed by Ukrainian forces, and it doesn't mean it fully controlled by the Russians. The entire southern flank from Chasiv Yar, no matter how hard the Russians tried to take control from October 2023, they never managed to accomplish that. Especially recently, their resources have decreased in the Ivanivske, Klishivka, and Andriivka districts because units of the 83rd Separate Amphibious Assault Brigade were redeployed to the Belgorod regions. Namely, the 83rd Russian unit worked in the direction of those three villages. Now it has been reoriented to Vovchansk, where the severest battles take place. Well, of course, because of this, the Russians have lost their offensive potential and sometimes even lose their positions. So the US extends its permission for Ukraine to strike targets in Russian territory, and Ukraine will receive a Patriot systems and more missiles, which is a good news because due to shortage of ammunition postponed by the US Congress actually pushed Ukrainians to lose some territories. The US has said that Ukraine can use its weapons to strike Russian forces that are firing at Ukrainian troops anywhere along the border, not just near the Kharkiv region. However, this doesn't apply to the use of ATACMS long range missiles. It only extends to a depth of not more than 100 kilometers or approximately 60-65 miles inside Russia. Key Russian air bases from which planes carrying glide bombs take off are not inside of this zone. The US President, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also said that Ukraine could use air defense systems to attack Russian aircraft flying over their territory if they are preparing to fire into Ukraine. Also, the National Security Council Representative John Kirby confirmed that the Biden administration has decided to send all Patriot interceptor missiles that will be manufactured in the near future to Ukraine. The same is true for NASAMS rockets. At the same time, with another ally, the Netherlands, will soon provide Ukraine with a Patriot installation, while Romania made a similar decision. With all the new permissions, Ukraine is in the process of eliminating Russian capabilities in various regions. For example, last week, Ukraine has eliminated 15 air defense systems in Crimea and destroyed $2 billion worth of tanks. Over the past 2 months, the armed forces of Ukraine have destroyed so many air defense systems in the temporarily occupied Crimea Peninsula. The Strategic Communications Center of the Ukrainian Armed Forces specified that Ukrainian forces damaged multiple divisions of S 300, S 350, and S 400 anti aircraft systems. More than 50 Russian radar stations, dozens of launchers, and more than 10 military control points were also destroyed. In this way, Ukraine is preparing a bridgehead for attack on Crimea after receiving F-16 fighter jets. According to many political scientists, during the war, the Ukraine Special Forces SBU have destroyed 1,006 Russian tanks worth more than $2 billion. In addition to tanks, special forces also destroyed a third Russian long range radar stations, each of which is worth about $100 million. President Zelensky stated that permission from Western countries to use their weapons in strikes on Russian border territory has slowed the advance of Russian troops in several regions and precisely in Kharkiv. So, as you see, we can only defeat the enemy if we unite our forces against the aggressor who is trying to erase Ukraine from the earth. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, please share it with your friends.